I want to start by asking Ian Bremmer, because you look at risk very carefully. Everyone watching at this time, and nobody really knows what happens next, but if I were to say, given the fact that we're now months into the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where do you see this war head militarily, and then we'll talk geopolitically?
Well, it's obviously too early to say what we think the outcome of the war is going to be. The Ukrainians have fought incredibly admirably, and NATO has come together to provide support. Will that continue to be the case in 3 months, in 6 months, in 12 months? Most people that I know at Davos and on this panel believe that this war is not going to end anytime soon. And so I think a level of humility around how uncertain the outcome is going to be is still a smart thing to do. But one thing that I think we can be very clear on is that Europe does feel an existential threat on the basis of this invasion. It is a threat to democracy, is a threat to their territorial integrity. It is the end of the peace dividend. They know they must spend real money on defense and prioritize national security going forward. That we know. The second thing that we know is that the level of decoupling of Russia from the advanced industrial democracies, not from the entire world, not from the democracies in the entire world, Lord knows India, but from the United States and its wealthy allies, that feels to me near complete and effectively permanent. I mean, for the long term, as long as Putin is in charge of Russia, as long as Russia looks like it does today, there is some form of Cold War between Russia and the West. But I think beyond that, there's still an awful lot to recognize that we don't know today.
Martin Wolf, your sense of what could be the next step in this war, where do you think things are heading?
Well, I would be an absolute fool, which I try to avoid, to predict the military outcomes. If Ian isn't prepared to do that, I won't. I think, to me, leaving aside that, this war obviously creates huge economic consequences. It's had big effects on energy prices, coming on top of already important energy price movements. It's creating a real risk and at least worry about famine, because this is the grain basket, or a grain basket of the world. That will have profound implications for developing countries. I think serious unrest is very likely in important food importing countries and energy importing countries, sometimes the same. And this is in the context of a still very unsettled world economy. The COVID shock is still there. We have exceptional inflation surges. So I think we have to look at this in addition to the tragedy there, the uncertainty about the outcome of the war, and I agree with everything Ian said. It's existential, clearly, for Europe. This is a very big global moment at a time of substantial economic stress, and we don't know how that will play out either.
So let's deal with the economics for a moment, leaving aside the military aspects. There's a lot of talk about the potential of famine. How real do you see the fear being, especially in places like North Africa? And economically, where do you see this war lead to next?
Well, the general rule that all economists have learned basically from the work of a very famous Indian economist, Amartya Sen, is that famine is a policy choice. That is to say, we basically never had a situation when there was generalized food shortages and where anybody, at least in the modern world, the last 100 years or so, has had to starve to death. It's a policy choice. There's certainly enough food. The question is whether, given the prices, and given where the stocks are, the food will be found and moved from the countries that have it to the countries that don't have it. This is a policy choice that has not yet been made. The IMF's managing director has made that very, very clear. I am optimistic, but it's a very big issue, that the wealthier countries of the world, including some very big food producers like Canada, Australia, the United States, and others, will be able to find ways, and Europe is actually very comfortably self-sufficient, to manage this. But it's a question of management. Like the debt crises, we are certainly going to see, given what's happening to the dollar and what's going to happen to interest rates, there is going to be a succession of significant crises in the developing and emerging world. And the question is not whether we can deal with them, there's no question we can, but whether the people will deal with them. And there's one important element in some of them, but not all, and that's China. If we're dealing with a debt crisis, China is now one of the biggest creditors of the developing and emerging world, and cooperation between the West and China on debt is essentially non-existent. So there are policy challenges I see rather than fatalities.
Very few people outside China understand China quite the way that Ambassador Mehbubani does. Looked at from your perspective, where do you see this crisis head next? Also possibly from a Chinese point of view?
Well, there's no doubt that the Ukraine war has hit China very badly. And it's been negative for China on at least 4 counts. Number one, President Xi Jinping wanted in the year 2022 calm and stability because it's an important political transition coming up. Instead, he's got to deal with the domestic challenge of ending COVID-19, zero policy, and also dealing with Ukraine. Number two, his number one strategic partner, Russia, has been seriously weakened. That's a loss for China. And number three, President Xi wanted to deal with a separate United States and a separate Europe, but Ukraine has completely consolidated Western solidarity, and so that's a setback geopolitically also for Xi Jinping. And fourthly, of course, I think probably the biggest shock for China was the fact that they thought they had $3.2 trillion of assets in their foreign reserves. Now they realize they can be seized overnight, just like half the central bank reserves of Russia were seized. So you can see how it's been negative for China on several counts. But having said that, I think it's very important to counterbalance the short-term shocks that we are facing with the long-term trends that are happening. And if you do a kind of a long-term trend, for let's say take this decade of 2020s, I can confidently predict that, and I'm going to say this even though I'm not the expert, for the 1.3 billion people in India, for the 1.4 billion people in China, and for the 700 million people in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, that this makes it 3.4 billion people, at the end of this decade, they'll be much better off. Because there are profound, deeply instituted policy changes have been put in place to ensure that growth will happen in this region. So let me just conclude with one statistic so you understand what I'm talking about. In the year 2000, the combined economy of ASEAN was 1/8 the size of Japan. Japan's economy was 8 times bigger. Now Japan's economy is only 1.5 times bigger. By 2030, ASEAN's economy will be bigger than Japan's.